A quiet father shows up to translate, and the room treats him like air. Then a powerful billionaire walks in and says he'll speak to no one but the man they ignored. In one breath, the unseen becomes the only voice that matters. A chance to lift his daughter, fix broken streets, and change lives within reach. But a sudden scandal explodes. Crowds turn, sponsors vanish, whispers paint the hero as the villain. Is this a setup or a second test? When your child's safety, your name, and your future are on the line, do you run from the storm or speak louder than ever and force the truth into the light? Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today. The morning sun barely pierced through the gray clouds hanging over New York City. In a modest apartment on the east side, David Carter stood at the stove, carefully flipping pancakes while stealing glances at his daughter Naomi. She sat at their small kitchen table, her legs swinging beneath her chair as she read a book. "Almost ready, sweetheart," David said, sliding another golden brown pancake onto a plate. The familiar rhythm of their morning routine brought him comfort, even as anxiety about the upcoming business meeting churned in his stomach. Naomi looked up from her book, her bright eyes meeting his. "Can you make a smiley face with the chocolate chips again, Daddy?" David's expression softened. "Of course." He arranged the chocolate chips into two eyes and a wide smile, just the way she liked it. The simple act of making his daughter happy pushed away his worries, if only for a moment. The kitchen was small but tidy, with family photos decorating the walls. Most of them showed just David and Naomi, though a few precious ones included Sarah, his late wife. Her absence still felt like a physical thing sometimes, especially during quiet moments like these. "Here you go, princess." David set the plate in front of Naomi, who beamed at the chocolate chip smile. He ruffled her hair gently before turning back to make his own breakfast. "Are you nervous about your meeting today?" Naomi asked between bites, showing that perceptiveness that sometimes caught him off guard. David paused, considering how to answer. "A little," he admitted. "But it's just another translation job. I've done plenty of those." "You're the best translator ever," Naomi declared with absolute certainty. "You know all those languages, and you always know exactly what people mean." Her faith in him made his chest tight. If only the rest of the world saw him the way his daughter did. "Thank you, baby. Now eat up. We need to get you to school." They finished breakfast, and David helped Naomi pack her backpack, making sure she had everything she needed. As they headed out the door, the cold air bit at their faces. David adjusted Naomi's scarf, tucking it more securely around her neck. "Remember, I'll pick you up after school," he said as they walked the few blocks to her school. "We'll have spaghetti for dinner. Your favorite." "Promise you'll be back in time?" Naomi asked, squeezing his hand. "I promise," David squeezed back. "I wouldn't miss our dinner for anything." At the school entrance, Naomi hugged him tight. "Good luck, Daddy. Show them how smart you are." David watched her disappear into the building before heading to the subway station. The train was crowded with morning commuters, all avoiding eye contact, all wrapped in their own worlds. David held onto a pole, his worn leather briefcase between his feet, and tried to steady his nerves. The corporate building where the meeting would take place towered over him, all glass and steel reaching into the cloudy sky. David straightened his tie and walked through the revolving doors, joining the stream of people flowing through the lobby. At the security desk, the guard barely glanced at his ID before waving him through. In the elevator, executives in expensive suits shifted away slightly, creating an invisible bubble around him. David had grown used to this treatment, but it still stung. The conference room was already filling up when he arrived. Men in tailored suits clustered in small groups, talking animatedly about golf scores and stock prices. David quietly made his way to the corner where the translation equipment was set up. "Excuse me," he said politely to a group blocking his path. They parted without acknowledging him, continuing their conversation as if he were merely a piece of furniture that had somehow gained the ability to speak. David set up his equipment with practiced efficiency, checking the microphone and adjusting his earpiece. He pulled out his notebook and pen, arranging them neatly on the small side table he'd been assigned. Everything in its place, ready to serve its purpose, just like him. The CEO of the American company, Mr. Thompson, swept into the room with an entourage of vice presidents. "All right, people, let's get this show on the road," he called out, his voice carrying that particular tone of someone used to being listened to. The executives scrambled to take their seats around the large mahogany table. Not one of them looked in David's direction, though he would be responsible for ensuring they could understand their Russian counterparts. David adjusted his earpiece one final time, trying to push away the familiar feeling of invisibility that settled over him like a heavy cloak. He thought of Naomi's words from this morning. "Show them how smart you are." But they seemed far away now, lost in the quiet hum of expensive suits and corporate power. As he sat in his corner, David wondered why he still let it affect him after all these years. He was good at his job, excellent even. He spoke 5 languages fluently and could navigate the subtle nuances of cross-cultural communication with skill. Yet here he was, once again, feeling like a shadow in a room full of light. The men around the table opened their leather portfolios and uncapped their Mont Blanc pens. They leaned forward, ready to discuss millions of dollars in international trade, while David Carter, the man who would make their communication possible, sat forgotten in his corner, wondering why he had bothered to show up at all. Looking at his own modest notebook and the standard ballpoint pen he'd brought, David felt the contrast keenly. He glanced at his watch, thinking of the spaghetti dinner he'd promised Naomi. At least there, in their small but warm kitchen, he would be seen. He would be valued. He would be himself. The meeting was about to begin, and David took a deep breath, settling into his professional routine. Whatever these men thought of him didn't matter. He had a job to do, and he would do it well, not for them, but for the little girl who believed her daddy could do anything. The mahogany conference room doors swung open with decisive force. A tall figure filled the doorway, his presence commanding instant attention. Sergei Ivanov stood there, dressed in an impeccably tailored charcoal suit, his silver hair catching the morning light that streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows. 2 stern-faced aides flanked him, their expressions equally intense. The animated chatter that had filled the room moments before died instantly. Coffee cups froze halfway to lips, and phones were hastily tucked away. Even the most senior executives straightened in their leather chairs. David Carter watched from his corner position, noting how Sergei's steel blue eyes swept across the room with careful deliberation. The Russian's face remained impassive, but there was something calculating in his gaze, something that suggested he was taking measure of everyone present. Mr. Ivanov, Thomas Bradford, the CEO, rose from his seat with an practiced smile. "Welcome to New York. We're excited to begin our discussions." He extended his hand, but Sergei merely nodded in response. The Russian oligarch took his seat at the head of the table, his movements unhurried and precise. His aides remained standing behind him, like sentinels. The room waited in tense anticipation as Sergei opened a leather portfolio with methodical care. When he finally spoke, his words came out in fluid Russian, catching everyone off guard. The executives exchanged confused glances. "I'm sorry," Bradford said, leaning forward. "But we were under the impression you spoke English. The contract discussions." Sergei continued in Russian, his tone firm and unwavering. One of his aides translated. "Mr. Ivanov says he will conduct this meeting in Russian. He believes true understanding comes from speaking in one's mother tongue." But this wasn't arranged," Bradford stammered, his confident demeanor cracking. "We don't have a translator prepared for this meeting." The other executives shifted uncomfortably in their chairs. Some began whispering among themselves, while others frantically tapped at their phones, presumably trying to find a last-minute solution. "This is completely unprofessional," muttered Jenkins, a senior vice president, loud enough for others to hear. "We have a tight schedule today." Sergei remained unperturbed by the growing chaos around him. He simply folded his hands on the table and waited, his expression betraying nothing of his thoughts. Bradford's face had turned an alarming shade of red. "Mr. Ivanov, please. We have preparing for this meeting for weeks. Surely we can conduct this in English. Sergei responded with a lengthy statement in Russian, his voice carrying across the room with authority. His aide began to translate, but Sergei held up his hand, silencing him. The tension in the room grew thicker. Several executives were now on their phones, desperately trying to arrange for a translator to come immediately. Others whispered about rescheduling, while a few simply sat there, looking increasingly frustrated. In his corner, David remained quiet, watching the scene unfold. He had been hired as a backup translator, an afterthought really, and no one had bothered to inform him which languages might be needed. They hadn't even asked about his qualifications beyond a cursory glance at his resume. Sergei suddenly stood up, his chair scraping against the floor. The room fell silent once again. His eyes scanned the faces around him before landing on David's corner. A slight smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. "Вы," Sergei said, pointing directly at David. "Вы будете говорить за меня." You will speak for me." Every head in the room turned toward David, the invisible man who had been relegated to the corner, now suddenly the center of attention. Dozens of pairs of eyes fixed on him, some confused, others desperate, and a few showing the first glimmers of recognition. Bradford looked between Sergei and David, his mouth slightly agape. You speak Russian?" he asked David, as if seeing him for the first time. Before David could respond, Sergei spoke again in Russian, his eyes never leaving David's face. This time, David understood every word. "I saw you when I entered. You were the only one in this room taking notes in Cyrillic. Now, shall we begin the real meeting?" The executives stared at David with a mixture of disbelief and sudden hope, their earlier dismissal of him forgotten in their desperate need for his skills. The corner that had been meant to hide him now framed him in sharp relief, and for the first time that morning, David Carter was truly seen. David's heart thundered in his chest as he rose from his corner seat. The leather-bound notebook trembled slightly in his hands. All eyes were fixed on him now. The same executives who had barely spared him a glance earlier were now staring, their expressions a mix of desperation and doubt. Sergei Ivanov spoke, his deep voice rolling through the conference room in fluid Russian. David closed his eyes for a moment, letting the words wash over him. When he opened them again, something had changed in his stance. His shoulders straightened, and his voice emerged clear and strong. "Ladies and gentlemen," David began, translating Sergei's words with careful precision, "I've reviewed your proposal, but I find myself wondering about the human element that seems absent from these pages." The executives exchanged uncertain glances. David continued, his translation carrying not just Sergei's words, but the subtle undertones of disappointment and challenge in the Russian's voice. His hands moved expressively as he spoke, bringing life to the message. "You speak of profit margins and market share," David translated, his voice taking on the same philosophical quality as Sergei's. "But where's the vision for lasting impact? Where is the consideration for the communities these developments will affect?" One of the executives, a man in an expensive blue suit, leaned forward. "Tell Mr. Ivanov that our projections clearly show—" "Mr. Ivanov is right here," Sergei interrupted in Russian, his tone sharp. David translated smoothly, adding, "Mr. Ivanov would prefer you address him directly, even though he will understand through translation." The executive flushed red and redirected his gaze to Sergei. David felt a small surge of satisfaction as he continued to bridge the language gap between them. His translation flowed naturally, capturing not just words but meanings, cultural nuances, and the subtle dynamics of power in the room. As the meeting progressed, David found himself becoming more than just a verbal bridge. When Sergei spoke about his vision for community development, David's voice carried the same passion. When the Russian businessman expressed frustration at short-sighted planning, David's translation conveyed that disappointment with diplomatic precision. The executives began to lean forward when David spoke, their pens poised over notepads. They were no longer looking through him but at him. Even their body language had changed. They turned their chairs to face him directly, unconsciously acknowledging his crucial role in the conversation. Sergei nodded approvingly, as David captured a particularly complex point about sustainable development. The Russian's eyes held a glimmer of something more than mere satisfaction. There was recognition there, an appreciation that went beyond David's technical skills. "Your translator," Sergei suddenly said in Russian, interrupting an executive's presentation. "He understands more than just words. He understands the heart of what we're discussing." David hesitated for a moment, uncomfortable translating praise about himself, but professionalism won out. As he translated Sergei's compliment, David felt a warm flush creep up his neck. The executives shifted uncomfortably in their chairs, perhaps remembering their earlier dismissive treatment of him. The meeting continued, with David growing more confident with each exchange. He no longer felt like the invisible man in the corner. His voice filled the room with authority, commanding attention not through volume or force, but through the quiet power of understanding and communication. Outside the conference room, unknown to David, a small figure pressed her face against the glass window. Naomi Carter stood on her tiptoes, her backpack still slung over one shoulder. The kind-faced receptionist who had let her wait there smiled at the girl's intense focus on the meeting inside. Naomi's eyes were fixed on her father. She watched as he stood tall among the suited executives, his voice carrying clearly even through the thick glass. She saw how everyone turned to him when he spoke, how even the important-looking man with silver hair nodded at her father's words. A proud smile spread across Naomi's face as she watched her father command the room with quiet dignity. In her eyes, he wasn't just translating, he was performing magic, turning one language into another, building bridges between people who couldn't understand each other. "Daddy's a hero," she whispered to herself, her breath fogging the glass slightly. In that moment, she forgot about the kids at school who teased her about her worn backpack, about the lonely lunches when no one sat with her. All she could see was her father, standing tall and strong, his voice reaching across boundaries of language and culture. Inside the conference room, David continued his work, unaware of his daughter's presence. He was focused entirely on the task at hand, translating complex financial terms and cultural concepts with equal ease. The morning sun had shifted, casting long shadows across the polished conference table, but the intensity of the discussion hadn't dimmed. What had started as a simple translation job had transformed into something more significant. David found himself at the center of a crucial negotiation, his voice carrying the weight of multi-million-dollar decisions. The executives who had ignored him earlier now waited patiently for his translations, understanding that their success depended on his skills. Sergei spoke again, his words measured and thoughtful. David translated, "We need to ensure that this project serves not just our immediate goals, but the broader community. The translation of profit into progress requires more than just financial calculations. It requires understanding, compassion, and vision." As David spoke these words, he felt their truth resonating within him. He wasn't just translating language, he was translating hope, possibility, and human connection. The weight of importance settled on his shoulders not as a burden, but as a mantle of responsibility he was ready to bear. Outside the window, Naomi continued to watch, her eyes shining with pride. To her, the scene before her was better than any superhero movie. Her father wasn't fighting villains or flying through the air, but he was doing something just as amazing. He was making people listen, understand, and connect. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows through the conference room windows as the meeting finally drew to a close. David gathered his papers, still processing the events of the day. His hands moved methodically, organizing notes that were filled with more writing than any previous translation job. Around him, executives in expensive suits huddled in small groups, their voices low but animated. "Did you see how he captured every nuance?" one whispered, not quite quietly enough. "Never seen anything like it," another replied, adjusting his silk tie. "The way he conveyed Ivanov's intent, not just the words." David kept his head down, pretending not to hear, but a small smile tugged at the corners of his mouth. For the first time in years, he felt seen, really seen. Naomi sat in a plush chair near the reception area, Homework spread across her lap. She looked up as executives filed past her, some now nodding politely to her father. Her eyes sparkled with pride. "Mr. Carter." The deep voice made David turn. Sergei Ivanov stood there, his imposing frame softened by a genuine smile. "Your translation today, it was exceptional." "Thank you, sir," David replied, automatically reaching for his professional tone. "I'm glad I could help." Sergei switched to Russian, his words flowing naturally. "No, you did much more than help. You understood. There is a difference." He glanced at Naomi, who was watching them curiously. "Your daughter?" David nodded, his face warming with affection. "Yes, this is Naomi." "Come," Sergei said, still in Russian. "Have dinner with me. There is much we should discuss." He paused, then added in careful English, "Your daughter is welcome too, of course." 20 minutes later, they sat in a private room at an upscale restaurant near Central Park. The walls were deep burgundy, lined with vintage photographs of old New York. Naomi's eyes widened at the elegant place setting before her. "The small fork is for salad," David whispered to her with a wink, and she giggled. Sergei waited until after their appetizers arrived before leaning forward, his expression serious. "Mr. Carter, what do you know about my business interests?" David carefully dabbed his mouth with a napkin. "Only what was covered in today's meeting, sir. Your investment portfolio is quite diverse." "Please, call me Sergei." The older man's eyes crinkled at the corners. "What you may not know is that I am, how do you say, at a crossroads in my life." David listened intently as Sergei continued, switching between Russian and English. The wealthy businessman spoke of his desire to use his fortune for meaningful change, to fund projects that would promote equality and understanding between communities. "Money without compassion," Sergei said, gesturing with his fork, "is like a body without a soul, empty." He turned to Naomi. "Your father has a gift. He doesn't just translate words, he builds bridges between people." Naomi beamed at her father. David felt his throat tighten with emotion. "Which brings me to my proposal," Sergei continued. "I want to establish a foundation here in America. Multiple projects, community centers, educational programs, cultural exchanges. But I need someone who understands both the language of business and the language of people." He fixed David with an intense gaze. "I want you to lead this initiative." David nearly dropped his fork. "Me? But I'm just a translator." "No," Sergei said firmly. "You are a bridge builder. I saw it today. The way you handled those executives, you made them listen, really listen, maybe for the first time in their lives." David glanced at Naomi, who was practically bouncing in her seat with excitement. It's a huge responsibility," he managed. "Yes," Sergei agreed, "but great change requires great courage." He pulled out a business card, sliding it across the table. "Think about it. We can discuss details later." The rest of dinner passed in a blur of exquisite food and gentle conversation. Sergei told stories that made Naomi laugh and asked her about school with genuine interest. By the time they stepped out into the evening air, the city had transformed into a glittering landscape of lights and shadows. David and Naomi walked home together, their path illuminated by storefront windows and street lamps. His daughter's small hand was warm in his, and she skipped every few steps, unable to contain her excitement. "Did you see their faces, Daddy, when you started speaking?" She tugged at his hand. "You were amazing." David squeezed her hand, still processing the enormity of Sergei's offer. The business card felt heavy in his pocket, like it carried the weight of all possible futures. "Daddy?" Naomi's voice was softer now, more serious. She stopped walking and looked up at him, her eyes reflecting the city lights. Her next words made his heart catch. "Mommy would be proud." The kitchen was still dark when David switched on the coffee maker at 5:30 a.m. Steam rose from the machine as he stood at the counter, running his finger along the edge of the thick manila envelope that had appeared under his door sometime during the night. The proposal from Sergei's office sat unopened, its presence as heavy as the doubts weighing on his mind. "Just look at it," he muttered to himself, reaching for his favorite chipped mug. A Father's Day gift from Naomi with "World's Best Dad" painted in wobbly letters. The coffee maker gurgled its last drops as he finally worked up the courage to break the seal. Page after page of carefully typed documents spilled onto his small kitchen table. Proposed salary figures made his eyes widen, more money than he'd ever seen. The position came with healthcare benefits, a company car, and even a housing allowance. It was everything he'd ever wanted for Naomi, wrapped up in official letterhead. But as the morning light slowly filled the kitchen, David's excitement gave way to gnawing uncertainty. He'd be responsible for millions in funding, choosing which community projects deserved support. People would look to him for leadership, expect him to speak at events, to be a public face. The thought made his stomach clench. "I'm just a translator," he whispered to his reflection in the window. "I help other people be heard. That's all I do." The sound of Naomi's alarm drifted from her bedroom. David quickly gathered the papers, tucking them back into the envelope. He couldn't let her see his doubt. She believed in him so completely. Sometimes he wished he could see himself through her eyes. After dropping Naomi at school, David found himself driving toward Greater Hope Baptist Church. It was barely 8 a.m., but he knew Pastor Williams would be there, just like every morning for the past 30 years. The old church stood proud, despite its peeling paint, its doors always open to troubled souls. David parked his weathered Honda next to the pastor's equally weathered pickup truck. Inside, the familiar scent of wood polish and old hymnals wrapped around him like a comfort blanket. He found Pastor Williams in his study, reading glasses perched on his nose as he prepared Sunday's sermon. "David Carter," the older man smiled warmly, setting aside his Bible. "I had a feeling I might see you today." "News travels fast," David said, sinking into the worn leather chair across from the pastor's desk. "When a Russian billionaire starts talking about investing in our community, people notice." Pastor Williams leaned back, his eyes kind but searching. "But that's not why you're here, is it?" David pulled out the envelope, placing it on the desk between them. "He wants me to lead it all. Me. I'd be in charge of deciding where the money goes, which programs to support." He shook his head. "I'm not qualified for this. I'm just..." "Just what?" Pastor Williams interrupted gently. "Just a single father who's raised a wonderful daughter? Just a man who's kept his dignity and faith through the hardest times? Just someone who can bridge worlds with his gift for languages?" "But this is different," David protested. "People's lives would depend on my decisions. What if I fail? What about Naomi?" Pastor Williams was quiet for a moment, then reached for his Bible. The pages fell open to a well-worn passage. "You know, Moses made the same argument. 'Who am I to lead?' he asked God. But God didn't call Moses because he was ready. God made him ready because he called him." The pastor's weathered hands smoothed the Bible's pages. "God does not call the equipped, David. He equips the called." Those words settled deep in David's chest, striking a chord of truth he couldn't ignore. "But how can I be sure this is a calling?" "Look at how it happened," Pastor Williams said. "You were invisible to those powerful men, yet God used your gift to make them see you. Now you have a chance to help others be seen." He smiled. "Sounds like a calling to me." David sat there for a long while, letting the morning sun warm his face through the stained glass windows. The pastor's words echoed in his mind, mixing with memories of yesterday, the respect in Sergei's eyes, the pride in Naomi's face as she watched him through the conference room window. That evening, after dinner was cleared away, David sat with Naomi on their small balcony. The city lights twinkled below like earthbound stars, and a cool breeze carried the distant sounds of traffic. "Remember that man from yesterday, Mr. Ivanov?" David began carefully. Naomi nodded, hugging her knees to her chest. "The one who made everyone listen to you?" "Yes," David smiled. He offered me a job, a big job, helping people in our community." "Really?" Naomi's eyes lit up. "What kind of job?" David tried to explain it simply. "I'd help decide where to build new programs, like after-school centers, job training places, things to make life better for people who need help." "That sounds amazing," Naomi exclaimed, then noticed her father's hesitation. What's wrong? It's a lot of responsibility, David admitted. I'm not sure I can do it. Maybe they need someone more qualified. Dad, Naomi interrupted, fixing him with a look so like her mother's it made his heart ache. You can speak Russian, like actual Russian. If you can do that, you can do anything. The pure faith in her voice made David laugh despite his fears. To Naomi, it was that simple. Her father could do anything. Maybe it was time he started believing it too. The leather chair creaked as David settled into it, his hands folded neatly in his lap. Sergei's private office, perched high above Manhattan in a gleaming tower, made David's modest apartment feel like it belonged to another world entirely. Floor-to-ceiling windows revealed a sprawling view of Central Park, its green expanse, a stark contrast to the steel and glass surrounding it. So, you have made your decision? Sergei's deep voice carried both warmth and authority as he poured 2 cups of tea from an ornate Russian samovar. Yes, sir. David's voice came out steadier than he expected. I accept your offer. Sergei's weathered face broke into a genuine smile as he handed David a delicate china cup. Please, call me Sergei. We will be partners in this endeavor, not master and servant. The tea's rich aroma filled David's nostrils as he took a careful sip. Thank you, Sergei. Now, Sergei said, moving to a large touchscreen mounted on the wall, let me show you what we will build together. With a few taps, blueprints materialized on the screen. Our first cultural center will be in Brooklyn. Not in the gentrified areas, but where people truly need it. David leaned forward, studying the plans. The proposed building was beautiful, modern yet welcoming, with large windows and open spaces. 3 floors, Sergei continued, his accent thickening with enthusiasm. Ground floor, community gathering spaces, cafe serving affordable meals, free internet access. Second floor, classrooms for language courses, job training, citizenship preparation. Top floor, performance venue and art galleries featuring local artists. It's impressive, David said softly, trying to imagine such a place in his own neighborhood. But this is just the beginning. Sergei pulled up more documents. We will establish scholarship programs, fund after-school activities, create mentorship opportunities. The building is important, yes, but what happens inside, this is what matters most. David's heart raced as Sergei outlined program after program. Adult education classes, youth leadership initiatives, senior citizen support services. Each one addressed a need he'd seen in his community, but had never had the resources to help with. And you want me to oversee all of this? David's voice carried a hint of uncertainty. Sergei set down his tea and fixed David with an intent gaze. You understand both worlds, David. You move between languages, between cultures, between communities. You see people, really see them. This is why I chose you. But I've never managed anything like this before, David admitted. The largest project I've handled was organizing a church fundraiser. And did you succeed? Well, yes, but then you understand the principles. The scale is different, but the heart is the same. Sergei pressed a button, and new figures appeared on the screen. You will have a full staff. Experts in every field. Your job is not to do everything. It is to be the bridge, just as you were in that meeting. David stood up, walking closer to the screen. Budget projections scrolled past, millions of dollars dedicated to community transformation. His fingers trembled slightly as he touched the glass. I feel like I'm dreaming, he whispered. Not dreaming, Sergei corrected. Finally waking up to your potential. He joined David at the screen. I have built empires of steel and concrete, moved billions across borders. But what does it mean in the end? Now, I want to build something that matters, something that changes lives. For several moments, they stood in silence, watching the plans rotate on the screen. David felt a curious mixture of terror and exhilaration. The responsibility was enormous, but so was the opportunity. When do we start? David asked. Tomorrow, Sergei replied with a grin. Your office is being prepared now, 1 floor down, corner suite with a view almost as good as mine. David's eyes widened. My own office, with a staff of 5 to start. They are eager to meet you. Sergey handed him a sleek laptop and a phone. These are yours now. My personal number is already programmed in. Call any time, day or night. Walking out of the building an hour later, David felt like he was floating. The weight of the laptop bag on his shoulder seemed to anchor him to reality. He caught his reflection in a store window. Same face, same clothes, but something had changed. There was a new light in his eyes, a straightness to his posture he hadn't seen in years. The next morning, dew still clung to the grass in the small park they cut through on their way to Naomi's school. David held his daughter's hand, watching her skip along beside him in her uniform and freshly braided hair. Naomi, he said, slowing their pace, I need to tell you something important. She looked up at him with those same bright eyes that reminded him so much of her mother. What is it, Daddy? Life is about to change, he said, squeezing her hand gently. The old community center's walls were covered in children's artwork, their bright colors a cheerful contrast to the worn linoleum floors. David adjusted his tie, clutching his portfolio as he followed Mrs. Thompson, the center's director, through the bustling hallways. Most of our kids come from working families, Mrs. Thompson explained, gesturing to the packed rooms they passed. We keep them safe and engaged until their parents can pick them up. A burst of laughter drew David's attention to a classroom where a young woman sat cross-legged on a reading carpet, surrounded by elementary school children. She was reading animatedly from a picture book, her voice rising and falling with the story's rhythm. That's Maria Lopez, Mrs. Thompson said warmly. One of our most dedicated volunteers. She teaches 3rd grade at PS 84 during the day, then comes here almost every afternoon. David watched as Maria closed the book, and the children eagerly raised their hands to discuss the story. Her gentle smile and patient responses reminded him of how his late wife used to interact with Naomi. Would you like to meet her? Mrs. Thompson asked. She runs our reading program. Before David could respond, a familiar voice called out, Daddy! Naomi burst from the classroom, wrapping her arms around his waist. Ms. Lopez, let me join the reading circle. Did you hear the story? Maria approached them, her brown eyes warm with amusement. Your daughter is quite the literature critic, Mr. Carter. She had some very insightful comments about the protagonist's journey. Please, call me David, he said, extending his hand. Her grip was firm and confident, her smile genuine. Maria, she replied. Naomi mentioned you might be visiting today. She's very proud of your new project. David felt his cheeks warm. Well, it's Mr. Ivanov's project, really. I'm just here to help facilitate. Don't let him fool you, Naomi piped up. Daddy's in charge of everything. He's going to help build a whole new center with lots of programs and… Naomi, David gently interrupted. Why don't you go finish the activity with your new friends? The adults need to talk. Once Naomi had skipped back to the classroom, Mrs. Thompson led them to her office. David explained Sergey's vision while Maria and Mrs. Thompson listened intently, occasionally exchanging excited glances. A dedicated space for after-school programs? Maria leaned forward in her chair. With actual resources and support staff? Do you know how many families that could help? David nodded, pulling out architectural renderings. The plans include a library, computer lab, and multiple classroom spaces. Mr. Ivanov wants to ensure every child has access to quality educational support. And adult education programs too? Mrs. Thompson asked, studying the blueprints. Evening classes for parents, David confirmed. Language courses, job training, financial literacy, whatever the community needs most. Maria's eyes sparkled with enthusiasm. This could change everything for our families. When can we start? For the next hour, they discussed logistics and possibilities. David found himself repeatedly drawn to Maria's passionate contributions. She knew every child by name, understood their challenges, and had practical suggestions for addressing them. As the meeting concluded, Maria offered to show David around the center. They walked through the halls, stopping to observe various activities. She pointed out the cramped spaces and makeshift solutions they developed to serve as many children as possible. It's not much, she admitted, but we do our best with what we have. You're doing amazing work, David said softly. The children clearly adore you. Maria smiled, tucking a strand of hair behind her ear. They just need someone to believe in them. Like Naomi, she's such a bright girl. She talks about you constantly, you know. She does? Mm-hmm. She told us all about how you translate for important people and how you're going to help build something special for the community. Maria's expression grew thoughtful. It's beautiful, seeing that kind of faith between father and daughter. David felt a familiar ache in his chest, grief mixed with gratitude. Her mother passed away when she was 5. Sometimes I worry I'm not enough. From what I've seen, Maria said gently, you're exactly what she needs. Their eyes met, and for a moment, David felt something shift in the air between them. It was familiar yet terrifying, a spark he hadn't experienced since Rachel was alive. The moment was broken by the sound of children being dismissed. Parents began arriving, and Maria excused herself to help with the afternoon pickup procedure. David found Naomi gathering her belongings, chattering excitedly about her time in the reading circle. That evening, after Naomi was asleep, David sat at his desk and opened the journal Rachel had given him shortly before she died. Write about your journey, she had said. Keep your heart open to joy. His pen hovered over the blank page as Maria's warm smile filled his thoughts. Finally, he began to write. Today I met someone who reminds me that life can surprise you with unexpected light. Her name is Maria, and she has Rachel's gift for making children feel seen and valued. When she smiles, David's hand trembled slightly. He closed the journal quickly, his heart racing with a mixture of guilt and possibility. Was he ready for these feelings? Would it be disloyal to Rachel's memory? The question swirled in his mind as he got ready for bed, but one thought kept returning. The way Maria's eyes had lit up when she talked about helping children, and how that light had awakened something he thought was long dormant in his own heart. The autumn wind scattered leaves across the playground as David waited outside Naomi's school. His heart sank when he saw her emerge from the building, head down and shoulders hunched. Even from a distance, he could tell something was wrong. Hey, sweetie, he called out softly. Naomi walked faster, almost running to him. When she reached him, she buried her face in his coat, her small body trembling. Can we just go home, Daddy? Her voice was muffled against his jacket. David placed a gentle hand on her back. Of course, baby. The walk home was quiet, broken only by Naomi's occasional sniffles. David's mind raced with worry, but he knew from experience not to push. Sometimes silence was the safest space. In their apartment, Naomi dropped her backpack by the door and curled up on the couch, hugging her favorite stuffed elephant, a gift from her mother. David hung up his coat and sat beside her, waiting. Finally, Naomi spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. They said I'm weird because I don't talk much. She wiped her eyes with her sleeve. Jenny told everyone not to sit with me at lunch because I'm too quiet, she said. Naomi's voice cracked. She said nobody wants to be friends with someone who acts like a ghost. David felt a familiar ache in his chest, the pain of watching his child hurt, mixed with memories of his own struggles. He gently pulled her close. You know what? He said, keeping his voice steady. When I was your age, I was just like you. Naomi looked up, surprise momentarily replacing the hurt in her eyes. Really? Really? David smiled softly. I was always the quiet kid in the corner with my nose in a book. Other kids thought I was strange because I loved learning different languages instead of playing sports. Did they make fun of you too? They did. David nodded. And for a long time, I believed what they said about me. I thought being quiet meant being invisible. Naomi clutched her elephant tighter. That's how I feel sometimes, like nobody sees me. But here's what I learned, David continued, turning to face her fully. Being quiet doesn't mean being weak. Remember last week at the business meeting? All those important people ignored me at first because I was quiet. But then you helped them talk to Mr. Ivanov, Naomi said, sitting up straighter. You were the only one who could. Exactly. David smiled. Sometimes the quiet ones are the strongest because we listen. We notice things others miss, and when it really matters, we find our voice. Naomi was quiet for a moment, processing his words. But how did you stop being scared? I didn't, David admitted. I still get scared sometimes, but I learned that being brave doesn't mean not feeling afraid. It means doing what's right, even when you're scared. He reached for Naomi's backpack and pulled out her notebook. Look at these stories you write. Your words are beautiful, Naomi. You have so much to share with the world. Don't let anyone make you feel like you need to be louder to be valuable. Naomi traced the doodles on her notebook cover. Miss Lopez said something like that too. She told me my writing is special. Miss Lopez is right, David agreed, thinking of Maria's gentle encouragement during their recent meetings at the community center. She sees how special you are, just like I do. They spent the evening making hot chocolate and looking through old photos of Naomi's mother. David told stories about how her mom had been shy too, but became a fierce advocate for her patients as a nurse. She found her voice by helping others, David explained. Just like I found mine, by helping people understand each other. The next morning, Naomi asked David to braid her hair, something she usually avoided because it made her stand out. I want to look like Mom today, she said firmly. Throughout the week, David noticed small changes. Naomi started wearing the colorful hair clips her mother had loved. She brought her writing notebook to school instead of hiding it in her desk. A week later, Naomi sat in Miss Lopez's English class, her heart pounding as the teacher asked for volunteers to read their creative writing assignments. The classroom felt huge, and Jenny's whispered giggles from 2 rows back seemed to echo. Naomi looked down at her story, a tale about a quiet dragon who saved its village not through fire and force, but through wisdom and kindness. Her father's words echoed in her mind. Sometimes the quiet ones are the strongest. Slowly, deliberately, she raised her hand. Maria Lopez's face lit up with a proud smile that warmed the whole room. Yes, Naomi? Taking a deep breath, Naomi stood up, holding her paper with slightly trembling hands. Her voice was soft but clear as she began to read. Once upon a time, there was a dragon who didn't roar. The grand ballroom of the Plaza Hotel sparkled with crystal chandeliers and elegant table settings. David Carter adjusted his bow tie for the 100th time, standing in a quiet corner away from the crowd of New York's elite who had gathered for the announcement of Sergei's cultural initiative. You look perfect, Daddy, Naomi said, reaching up to straighten his lapel. She wore a navy blue dress that made her look older than her 10 years, her hair styled in neat braids decorated with silver clips. Thank you, sweetheart. David smiled down at her, drawing strength from her presence. Are you sure you don't want to sit with Maria at the teacher's table? No way. I'm staying right here with you. Naomi squeezed his hand. The room hummed with conversation as waiters glided between tables with champagne flutes and sparkling water. David recognized faces from magazine covers and newspaper articles, CEOs, politicians, and philanthropists who probably wouldn't have given him a second glance 3 months ago. Sergei Ivanov stood at the center of the room, commanding attention in his perfectly tailored tuxedo. He caught David's eye and nodded, a gesture that had become familiar over their weeks of working together. Ladies and gentlemen, the event coordinator announced through the microphone, please take your seats. David led Naomi to their table near the front, where Maria sat in a deep green dress that made her eyes shine. She smiled warmly at them both. The first hour passed in a blur of speeches and presentations about the initiative's goals, cultural centers in underserved communities, educational programs, and bridges between different neighborhoods of the city. David translated Sergei's words when needed, his voice steady and clear through the sound system. Then Sergei approached the podium again, his expression thoughtful. Before we conclude, he said in Russian, which David translated automatically, I want to introduce someone special. He paused, looking directly at David. The man who has given voice not just to my words, but to the spirit of this entire project. David Carter, would you please join me? David froze. This wasn't part of the program. Naomi gave him a gentle push, and he found himself walking to the stage, his heart thundering in his chest. Sergei handed him the microphone. "Tell them your story, my friend," he said softly in Russian. "Tell them why this matters." The spotlight felt warm on David's face. As he looked out at the sea of expectant faces, he took a deep breath, remembering his pastor's words about being equipped when called. "Good evening," he began, his voice steadier than he felt. "For most of my life, I've been invisible. Not literally, of course, but in the way that really matters, in the way people see you or don't see you." He paused, finding Naomi's encouraging smile in the crowd. "I'm a widowed father, a translator, a man who used to stand in corners of rooms like this one, watching the world happen around me." The room grew silent, hanging on his words. But something changed. Someone looked past the surface and saw value in what I could offer. He glanced at Sergei. It wasn't just about speaking Russian. It was about bridging worlds, connecting hearts, helping people truly understand each other. David's voice grew stronger as he continued. "That's what this initiative is about. It's about seeing the invisible people in our city, the children who need a chance, the communities that need a voice, the dreams that need just a little support to bloom." He shared stories from his visits to community centers about the hope he'd seen in people's eyes when they realized someone was finally listening. He talked about his daughter, about raising her alone, about teaching her to stand tall even when the world tried to make her small. "We all have moments when we feel invisible," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "But sometimes all it takes is one person to really see us, to change everything. That's what we're trying to do here, to see each other, to hear each other, to lift each other up." As David finished speaking, the room remained silent for a heartbeat. Then, like a wave, people began to stand. The applause started slowly, building to a thunderous roar that filled the ballroom. Faces that had once looked past him now shone with tears and genuine smiles. Through the blur of his own tears, David saw Naomi running toward the stage. She flew up the steps and threw her arms around him, nearly knocking him backward. "You're my hero," she whispered fiercely in his ear, holding him tight. David held his daughter close, overwhelmed by the moment. Maria was standing and applauding with tears in her eyes. Sergei beamed with pride beside them. The applause continued, washing over them in waves of appreciation and recognition. In the back of the room, the young reporter's phone buzzed insistently. She glanced down at the breaking news alert, her eyes widening as she read the message. Russian billionaire Sergei Ivanov under federal investigation for alleged corruption. But on the stage, in that moment of triumph, David Carter stood tall, holding his daughter, finally and fully seen. David's alarm buzzed at 6 the next morning, but he was already awake. He hadn't slept. His phone had been vibrating all night with messages and missed calls. The morning light filtered through his bedroom window, casting long shadows across the floor. In the kitchen, the newspaper waited on his doorstep like a ticking bomb. The headlines screamed in bold letters: "Russian oligarch under investigation. Local translator implicated." Below it, there was a photo of him shaking hands with Sergei at the gala, both men smiling. Last night's moment of triumph now looked like evidence of wrongdoing. David's hands trembled as he made Naomi's breakfast. The oatmeal burned, the toast came out black, everything felt wrong. "Daddy?" Naomi's voice was small behind him. "Why is Mrs. Johnson from next door looking at our window like that?" David turned to see their elderly neighbor quickly pulling her curtains shut. His chest tightened. "Some people, they believe what they read in the papers, sweetheart. What are they saying about you?" He couldn't bring himself to answer. Instead, he forced a smile and handed her the backup Pop-Tarts he kept for emergencies. Time for school. The walk to school was different today. People crossed the street when they saw him coming. A man he'd greeted every morning for 5 years suddenly found his phone fascinating as David passed. Each avoided glance, each whispered conversation felt like a tiny knife. At the school gates, a group of parents huddled together, their conversation dying as David approached. One mother pulled her child closer. "I'll be fine, Daddy," Naomi said, squeezing his hand. but her brave face couldn't hide the fear in her eyes. He watched her walk into the building, his heart heavy. His phone buzzed again, another sponsor pulling out of the Cultural Center project. That made 7 since midnight. At home, David tried to work on his regular translation jobs, but his inbox was empty. Previous clients had quietly disappeared. The phone rang. It was Maria. He let it go to voicemail. She'd called 3 times since last night. The voicemail notification blinked. "David, please pick up. We need to talk about this. The kids at school. Naomi needs support. We all do. You don't have to face this alone." Her voice cracked with concern, making his chest ache. But he deleted the message. Maria was good, pure. She didn't deserve to be dragged into this mess. The day crawled by in a haze of news alerts and cancellation emails. Each hour brought fresh accusations, new theories about his involvement. Someone had dug up photos of him at various meetings with Sergei, twisting innocent moments into conspiracy evidence. At 2:30, the school called. "Mr. Carter, there's been an incident." He found Naomi in the principal's office, tears streaming down her face. Her new backpack, the one she'd been so proud of, was covered in marker. "Crook's kid" was scrawled across it in angry black letters. "I tried to stop them," Maria said, appearing in the doorway. Her eyes were red. "David, please let me help." But he couldn't look at her, couldn't bear to see the compassion in her eyes. He gathered Naomi's things and led her out, ignoring Maria's outstretched hand. That evening, after putting Naomi to bed, David sat alone in his dark living room. The city lights flickered outside his window. A world that had seemed full of promise just yesterday now felt cold and distant. His phone showed 37 missed calls. The latest news alert suggested federal investigators might want to question him. The Cultural Center project, his chance to make a real difference, was falling apart. Even his church had asked him to take a break from his duties until things were cleared up. The ceiling above him blurred as tears filled his eyes. "Maybe I was never meant to matter," he whispered to the empty room. The words hung in the darkness, heavy with defeat. All those years of feeling invisible, they had been safer. Being seen had only led to this: suspicion, accusations, shame, his daughter's tears, Maria's heartbreak. A lifetime of careful dignity crumbling under the weight of headlines and whispers. The night stretched long before him, filled with the echoes of unanswered calls and the weight of tomorrow's uncertainties. In the quiet, David Carter, once invisible, then briefly significant, now infamous, stared at his ceiling and felt the world closing in around him once more. The shadows in his apartment grew longer, and with them, the distance between the man he'd hoped to be and the man the world now believed him to be. Tomorrow would bring more headlines, more whispers, more avoided glances, but for now, in the darkness, he let himself feel small again, wondering if invisibility had been a blessing all along. The morning sunlight struggled through the kitchen window of their small apartment, casting weak shadows across the breakfast table. David sat hunched over his coffee. The newspaper spread before him like a battlefield map showing all the ways his world had crumbled. The headlines screamed accusations. Russian oligarch under investigation. Local charity projects questioned. Carter connection raises concerns. He hadn't slept. Dark circles rimmed his eyes, and his usually neat shirt was wrinkled. The coffee had gone cold, untouched. His phone kept buzzing with messages he couldn't bear to read. The silence in the apartment felt heavy, broken only by the quiet footsteps of Naomi padding into the kitchen. David quickly folded the newspaper, trying to hide the headlines, but Naomi had already seen them at school yesterday. She stood in her favorite yellow pajamas, her hair still messy from sleep, but her eyes were clear and determined. "Daddy," she said softly, her voice trembling but firm, "you always told me to stand tall when people don't see you. Now you have to show me how." The words hit David like a physical blow. He looked up at his daughter, seeing not just the little girl who needed his protection, but a mirror reflecting his own teachings back at him. Her small hands were clenched at her sides, and tears shimmered in her eyes, but her chin was raised, just like he'd taught her. "Baby, It's not that simple, David began, his voice rough. Sometimes when people think badly of you, you told me it doesn't matter what they think, Naomi interrupted. You said what matters is what's true. She moved closer, placing her small hand over his larger one. And I know you're good, Daddy. I know it. David felt his throat tighten. How many times had he held Naomi after she came home crying because other kids ignored her or made fun of her? How many times had he told her to hold her head high, to know her own worth even when others couldn't see it? Yesterday at school, Naomi continued, her voice getting smaller. Jenny Martinez said you were a crook. She said her mom told her to stay away from me. A tear rolled down her cheek, but she wiped it away quickly. I remembered what you said about being brave, so I told her she was wrong. I stood tall, Daddy, just like you taught me. David pushed back his chair and opened his arms. Naomi came to him immediately, climbing onto his lap like she used to when she was smaller. He could feel her trembling slightly, but her back was straight. I'm so proud of you, baby, he whispered into her hair. So proud. Then don't give up, she pleaded, pulling back to look at him. You haven't done anything wrong. You help people. You make them understand each other. Her eyes, so like her mother's, searched his face. Remember when Mommy got sick, and you said we had to be brave together? David's heart clenched at the memory. Those final months with Sarah had been the hardest of his life, but he'd forced himself to stay strong for Naomi. Every morning, they'd stand in front of the mirror together, practicing their brave faces. I remember, he said softly. We're still together, Naomi said, touching his cheek, and we're still brave. David looked at his daughter, really looked at her. In her face, he saw Sarah's strength, his own determination, and something uniquely Naomi, an unshakable faith in goodness. He'd spent years teaching her to value herself, to stand tall in a world that might try to make her feel small. Now she was teaching those lessons back to him. You're right, he said, his voice growing stronger. We can't let fear win. We can't let other people's words make us forget who we are. Naomi's face lit up with hope. So you won't hide anymore? You'll fight back? David pulled her close again, feeling her small heart beating against his chest. In that moment, he realized that his response to this crisis would shape more than just his own future. It would teach Naomi about courage, about integrity, about facing adversity with dignity. Yes, baby, he said, holding her tight. We'll stand tall together. She wrapped her arms around his neck, and David felt something shift inside him. The weight of despair began to lift, replaced by a familiar determination. He had faced invisibility before. He had endured loss before. He had risen before, and he would rise again, not just for himself, but for the bright-eyed little girl who believed in him with all her heart. They stayed like that for a long moment, father and daughter, their breakfast growing cold on the table, the morning sun growing stronger through the window. In the warmth of their embrace, David found his courage again, reminded by a child's wisdom that true strength often comes from standing tall, even when you feel smallest. The community center's meeting room buzzed with tension. Every fold-out chair was filled, and people lined the walls, their arms crossed and faces set in stern expressions. David stood at the podium, his hands steady despite his racing heart. The familiar space where he'd once shared Sergei's vision of hope now felt like a courtroom. How do we know you weren't in on it from the start? Called out Mr. Thompson, a local business owner who'd initially supported their projects. His voice carried accusation and disappointment. David took a deep breath, remembering Naomi's words from breakfast. Stand tall. I understand your doubts, he said, his voice quiet but clear. A few months ago, I was just a translator trying to make ends meet. When Sergei chose me to lead these projects, I was as surprised as anyone. Mrs. Chen, who ran the corner grocery store, stood up. But you were close to him. You must have known something wasn't right. David looked at her directly. I translated his words, Mrs. Chen, but I also translated his heart, or at least what he showed me of it. Every project we started together, the after-school programs, the cultural center plans, the community gardens, came from a place of genuine care. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Some nodded slowly, while others shook their heads. I'm not here to defend Sergei, David continued, his voice growing stronger. I'm here because these projects matter to our community. They matter to our children. He glanced at Maria, who sat in the third row, her presence giving him strength. I'm scared too, scared that everything we've built might crumble, scared that my daughter will face more whispers at school, but I won't hide from you. Pastor Roberts, who'd known David for years, raised his hand. Tell us honestly, son, did you ever see anything suspicious in the finances? No, sir, David replied firmly. Every dollar I handled went straight to our programs. I made sure of it. I may have been naive about Sergei's other dealings, but I never compromised on integrity, not once. A young mother stood up, bouncing a fussy baby. My son loves the reading program you started. He's finally getting better grades. Her voice wavered. I want to believe in you, Mr. Carter. David's throat tightened. I'm not asking for blind trust. I'm asking for a chance to prove that our work here is real and honest. I'll open every book, share every document, because this isn't about me or Sergei anymore. It's about what we can still do together. The tension in the room began to shift. A few people uncrossed their arms. Mr. Thompson's hard expression softened slightly. I remember when you were just the quiet man who translated at business meetings, said Mrs. Rodriguez, an elderly resident. Now look at you, standing up here, fighting for our neighborhood. That takes courage. David felt a weight lift from his shoulders. I learned that courage from my daughter, he admitted. She told me this morning that I taught her to stand tall when people don't see you. Sometimes our children are our best teachers. A few chuckles broke through the tension. More heads nodded. I propose we continue the programs. Pastor Robert stood up. With proper oversight, of course. All in favor? Hands began to rise, slowly at first, then more confidently. Not everyone raised their hand, but enough did to make David's heart swell with gratitude. As the meeting dispersed, people approached David one by one. Some offered words of support, others still had questions, but the hostility had melted into cautious hope. Mr. Thompson came up last. I'm still watching you, Carter, he said, but there was respect in his voice now. But I saw something today I didn't expect, a man willing to face his critics head on. That counts for something. David nodded, understanding that trust would need to be rebuilt slowly. As the room emptied, Maria approached him. She hadn't spoken during the meeting, but her presence had anchored him. She reached for his hand and squeezed it gently. This is the man I believed in, she said softly. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows through the windows of David's apartment when his phone buzzed. Naomi looked up from her homework at the kitchen table, watching her father's expression change as he read the message. It's Mr. Ivanov, David said softly, his hand tightening around the phone. He wants to meet. Naomi's pencil stopped moving. Are you going to go? David walked to the window, looking out at the city skyline. The past few weeks had been a storm of accusations and whispers. Every time he'd walked Naomi to school, he'd felt the weight of judgment from other parents. The community programs he'd helped build were struggling, and some families had pulled their children out entirely. I have to, he finally answered. Sometimes doing the right thing means facing hard conversations. An hour later, David stood outside a small coffee shop in a quiet corner of the city. It wasn't the kind of place he'd expected Sergei to choose. No marble floors or crystal chandeliers. Just a humble storefront with steamy windows and the smell of fresh coffee. Inside, Sergei sat alone in a corner booth, his usual commanding presence diminished. His suit, though expensive, looked rumpled, and dark circles shadowed his eyes. When he saw David, he stood quickly, extending his hand. Thank you for coming, Sergei said in Russian, his voice hoarse. Please, sit. David slid into the booth, noting how different this felt from their first meeting. The mighty oligarch looked almost fragile in the soft cafe lighting. I know what people are saying about me, Sergei continued in his native tongue, his fingers wrapped tightly around an untouched cup of coffee. About us. But David, you must believe me, I am innocent. David studied the man's face, searching for any sign of deception. He'd spent weeks questioning everything, wondering if he'd been naive to trust Sergei's vision of compassion and change. Sergei's eyes welled with unexpected tears. These charges, they are political. Enemies who do not want to see change. They think if they destroy me, they destroy the dream of what we built. His voice cracked. But worse than destroying me, they are destroying good people like you who believed in this mission. A waitress approached with a pot of coffee, but Sergei waved her away. He reached into his briefcase and pulled out a thick folder of documents. Here is the truth, he said, spreading papers across the table. Bank records, correspondence, everything that proves where every dollar went, not to corruption, to children's programs, to education, to building bridges between communities. David's hands trembled as he examined the documents. Years of working as a translator had taught him to read between the lines, to understand not just words but intentions. What he saw in these papers matched everything Sergei had ever told him about his mission. There will be a public hearing next week, Sergei explained, his voice strengthening with purpose. I need someone I trust to translate my testimony, someone who understands not just my words, but my heart. He leaned forward. I need you, David. The request hung heavy in the air. David thought of Naomi, of how hard these weeks had been for her, of Maria, who still believed in him despite everything, of his community, divided and uncertain. If I do this, David said carefully, and you're not telling me the truth, it won't just be my reputation at stake. It will be my daughter's future, the trust of everyone who believed in me. Sergei reached across the table, gripping David's arm with surprising gentleness. You taught me something, David. When we first met, you showed me that true translation isn't just about words, it's about conveying truth from one heart to another. That is why it must be you. You will hear in my voice if I am lying. David closed his eyes, remembering Naomi's words. Daddy, you always told me to stand tall when people don't see you. Now you have to show me how. I'll do it, he said, opening his eyes to meet Sergei's gaze. Not for you, but for the truth. The day of the hearing arrived with a media frenzy. Cameras crowded the courthouse steps, and reporters shouted questions as David walked inside. He kept his head high, remembering his daughter's courage. In the packed hearing room, David took his place at the translator's podium. Sergei sat before the panel of investigators, his posture straight, but his hands clasped tightly in his lap. As the proceedings began, David heard the familiar click of cameras. Sergei began to speak, his Russian flowing strong and clear. David closed his eyes for a moment, centering himself. When he opened them, he began to translate, his voice carrying every nuance of Sergei's testimony. I came to America not to build monuments to wealth, David translated, his voice steady, but to invest in its heart, its people. Every decision, every dollar, was devoted to this purpose. Hour after hour, David conveyed Sergei's words with unwavering precision. He translated complex financial explanations, emotional appeals, and detailed rebuttals to each accusation. Through it all, his voice remained strong, carrying not just Sergei's words but the ring of truth he heard in them. Camera flashes punctuated the air like lightning, but David didn't flinch. In this moment, he was no longer invisible. He was the voice of truth, standing tall in the storm, just as he'd taught his daughter to do. The morning headlines blazed across every major newspaper and news website. Russian philanthropist cleared of all charges. David sat at his kitchen table, coffee growing cold, as he read article after article. Each one painted the same picture. Sergei Ivanov had been the target of false accusations, and his translator, David Carter, had stood by him when others ran. Daddy! Naomi burst into the kitchen, still in her pajamas, waving her tablet. You're on TV again. Sure enough, there he was on the morning news, standing beside Sergei at yesterday's hearing, translating with dignity and conviction. The news anchor's voice carried through the tablet speakers. In a stunning turn of events, federal investigators have fully exonerated Sergei Ivanov of all wrongdoing. Sources say the allegations were part of a coordinated attempt to discredit his humanitarian efforts. Special mention must be made of David Carter, whose unwavering loyalty and integrity throughout this ordeal has drawn praise from community leaders. David's phone hadn't stopped ringing since dawn. Former sponsors called to apologize and reinstate their support. Community leaders who had distanced themselves now wanted meetings. The Cultural Center's donation page was crashing from too many visitors. "Mr. Carter?" his building's doorman called up. "There's a whole bunch of reporters downstairs wanting to talk to you." David smiled and shook his head. "Tell them I'm spending the morning with my daughter." Naomi bounced on her toes. "Can we go to the Cultural Center later, please?" "After school," David promised, helping her pack her backpack. "I hear they're putting up new signs today." At Naomi's school, the whispers were different now. Kids who had taunted her weeks ago now bragged about knowing the famous Mr. Carter's daughter. But Naomi just held her head high, remembering how her father had taught her to act with grace. Maria was waiting by the school entrance, her warm smile making David's heart skip. He hadn't seen her since that community meeting where she'd squeezed his hand. He'd been too afraid to reach out after, not wanting to burden her with his troubles. "I knew you were innocent," she said softly. "Both of you." "Maria?" David started, but she shook her head. "No apologies needed. You did what was right, even when it was hard. That's the man I." She paused, blushing slightly. "That's who you are." Naomi looked between them, trying to hide her grin. "Miss Lopez, want to see the new Cultural Center after school? Daddy's taking me." Maria's eyes met David's. "I'd love to, if your father doesn't mind." The Cultural Center was buzzing with activity when they arrived that afternoon. Workers were installing a grand new sign above the entrance. The Ivanov Carter Center for Community Unity. Inside, phones rang constantly with new pledges of support. The donation total on the electronic board kept climbing, already triple their original goal. Sergei himself was there, speaking with reporters. When he saw David, he broke away immediately, embracing him like a brother. "My friend," he said in Russian, "you showed me what true integrity looks like." David translated for Maria and Naomi, but Sergei switched to careful English. No translation needed now. They should hear directly, "You are proof that one person's courage can change many lives." Naomi beamed up at her father, slipping her small hand into his. Gone was the shy girl who used to hide behind him. Now, she stood tall, proud of who she was and whose daughter she was. As the afternoon wound down, Maria suggested they grab dinner. "I know a quiet little place," she said, "away from all the cameras and reporters." David hesitated only a moment before saying yes. The three of them found a cozy Italian restaurant a few blocks away, tucked between a bookstore and a flower shop. The owner recognized David from the news and insisted on giving them the private corner booth. Naomi ordered spaghetti, twirling it expertly on her fork as she chatted about her day at school. Maria shared funny stories about her students, and David found himself laughing more than he had in years. The sound surprised him, deep and genuine, like rediscovering a part of himself he thought was lost. "I miss this," Maria said softly, when Naomi was distracted by the dessert menu. "Just being together." David looked at her, really looked at her, and felt the walls around his heart crack just a little more. "I pushed you away," he admitted. "I was scared of hurting you." "You can't hurt me by being honest," she replied, "or by being brave." Naomi pretended to study the menu, but her eyes peeked over the top, watching them with hope. When David reached across the table and took Maria's hand, his daughter's smile could have lit up the whole restaurant. The owner brought them tiramisu on the house, and they shared it between the three of them, forks clinking against the plate as they laughed and talked. The troubles of the past weeks felt far away, replaced by something warm and healing and new. Looking at Maria's gentle smile and Naomi's shining eyes, David realized that sometimes the greatest victories weren't in grand public moments, but in quiet ones like this, where love and trust could finally bloom again, where old wounds could begin to heal, where a small family could grow just a little bigger. Naomi's laughter rang out at one of Maria's jokes, clear and bright as a bell. It filled their corner of the restaurant, wrapped around them like a warm embrace, and David knew that this moment, this feeling, was what truly mattered. The autumn sun painted golden streaks across the new cultural center's glass facade. A sea of faces filled the plaza, children clutching small flags, parents with proud smiles, community leaders in their Sunday best. The building itself seemed to glow, its modern architecture softened by touches of traditional design from various cultures. David Carter stood at the entrance, his heart thundering in his chest. The crisp morning air carried the scent of fresh paint and new beginnings. To his right, Naomi beamed in her yellow dress, practically bouncing on her toes with excitement. To his left, Maria's steady presence anchored him, her hand occasionally brushing against his in silent support. "You ready?" Maria whispered, straightening his tie with gentle fingers. David nodded, his throat tight with emotion. Just 6 months ago, he'd stood in this same spot, then just an empty lot, feeling invisible and uncertain. Now, the dream had become reality in steel, glass, and stone. The crowd hushed as David approached the podium. Familiar faces dotted the audience, his pastor sitting in the front row with an encouraging smile, community leaders who'd stood by him during the scandal, children from Maria's classroom waving excitedly. Even the corporate executives who had once dismissed him sat attentively, their earlier condescension replaced with something that looked remarkably like respect. Sergei Ivanov sat in a place of honor, his weathered face betraying deep emotion. The Russian businessman had flown in specifically for this moment, and his presence felt like a final validation of their shared vision. David cleared his throat, his hands steady on the podium. "When I was a boy," he began, his voice carrying across the plaza, "my mother used to tell me that dignity wasn't something others could give you, it was something you carried inside." He paused, meeting Naomi's eyes. "But she also taught me that sometimes it takes someone else seeing your dignity to help you remember it's there." A murmur of understanding rippled through the crowd. David continued, his voice growing stronger. "This center isn't just about programs or services. It's about seeing each other, really seeing each other. It's about recognizing the dignity in every person who walks through these doors, regardless of where they come from or what language they speak." He gestured to the building behind him. "Inside, you'll find classrooms where children will learn not just subjects, but self-worth. There are spaces where cultures will meet and blend, where stories will be shared, where bridges will be built. But most importantly, you'll find people who believe in the power of compassion to transform lives." David's gaze swept across the audience, lingering on the corporate executives who had once treated him like furniture. 6 months ago, I stood in a conference room feeling invisible. Today I stand here knowing that every one of us has the capacity to make others feel seen, heard, and valued. Tears glistened in many eyes now. Maria dabbed at her cheeks with a tissue, while Naomi stood straighter, her chin lifted with pride. "This center," David continued, his voice thick with emotion, "is built on faith, faith in each other, faith in our community, and faith that when we choose to see the best in people, they often surprise us by showing it." He smiled at Sergei, who nodded back solemnly. "Through every challenge, through every doubt, that faith has carried us forward." The morning sun caught the tears on his cheeks as David spoke his final words. "Let this place be a reminder that no one is invisible, that every voice matters. That dignity, once recognized, can change not just a person but an entire community." As applause thundered across the plaza, the same executives who had once looked through David now lined up to shake his hand. Their handshakes were firm, their eyes meeting his with newfound respect. Some offered quiet apologies, others words of congratulation. Each interaction felt like another brick in the bridge between worlds. The ribbon-cutting ceremony began. David held one end of the giant scissors, with Naomi and Maria's hands joining his on the handle. Just before they cut, Naomi pressed close to his side. "We're not invisible anymore, Daddy," she whispered, her words meant only for him. David looked up at the bright morning sky, tears flowing freely now. His lips moved in a silent prayer of gratitude, his heart too full for words. As the ribbon fluttered to the ground and cheers erupted around them, He felt his late wife's presence, her pride joining Naomi's, Maria's, and his own in this moment of triumph. The doors of the cultural center swung open, welcoming the future with open arms. What would you do if you were in their place? Comment your answer below, and let's see how you'd rewrite the ending. If you enjoyed the story of David Carter, I handpicked the next story that you will enjoy. Please don't miss this one. Click here to watch it.